Hi, everyone. Let's take our seats, please. Thanks. Thanks to those who are seated. We're going to begin. All right. So for the next section, this is a section that will be facilitated by Dr. Basani Baloyi, who's from the IEJ, and we'll be dealing with some research that we have been conducting internally as the center. So just to remind everyone, we are set up and thankfully have some funding. We're set up by the federations to conduct evidence-based research, but we ourselves also do some of the research. So in the panel previously, that was the commissioned research. This one's the internal research, which includes our ability through some of the researchers at TIPS, based at TIPS. We also have a number of researchers there that have very good evidence-based research that focuses around the just transition as applicable to our mandate. So I'd like to call all of those part of this panel into the stage. Discussant is Basani, and then we've got Simba, Nothembi, Chere, Seutame, and Lisa as well. We're going to, I'll hand over that to Basani. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. And yes, we are on to the next session, which will be looking at the center's internal research. It is really a privilege to chair this session, so thank you for asking me to do so. And this session brings a series of what I am certain will be quite insightful papers that speak directly to the heart of one of the most challenging issues of our time, based on the theme of today's workshop. So I don't know, I'm getting some feed, but I hope you can hear me. The 4 papers in the session are slated to offer a compelling and multifaceted exploration of the just transition in the South African context. Each paper, I'm certain through the titles, will in its own way contribute to a richer and more nuanced understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. So we will begin with Dr. Simbarashe, Mhaka, and Nothembi Mahlangu from the Just SA Economist, who will take us beyond the coal mine to assess the existing provisions for industry provisions for South African coal workers. And then we will be followed by Chere Monaisa, another researcher who will present her research on workers' perceptions of climate change and the just transition. And she will be followed by Seutame Maimele, a TIPS economist who will broaden our perspective to the international stage with a timely analysis of border carbon adjustments. And then finally, we will have Lisa Ali, a JTLC researcher, who will offer a critical assessment of 30 years of COP policies over the last. So who would you like to join me on stage?
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues. As the discussant said, my name is Nothembi Mahlangu, and I am an economist at TIPS under the Just SA project. And my presentation is going to be on assessing the existing industry provisions for South African coal workers in transition. And it will also be a presentation by my colleague Simbarashe. Okay, so I'm not going to go entirely in depth of what the issue is. We do know what the problem is, but our research is really trying to answer how can government intervene effectively to manage the transition and also minimize the harm while maximizing the potential benefits. And essentially, let me just And essentially, I mean, we know what the problem is. There are coal mine closures, and the reality is that most of all of the mines will reach their end of operational life, but the associated socioeconomic hardships and also can be mitigated through proactive planning and also targeted support packages, coordinated interventions. And there is also an issue of designing and also implementing the targeted support packages in transitioning the coal workers. It is a complex and it is also costly. But there are existing frameworks that can assist the just transition, achieving a just transition through the social and labor plans mandated under the MPRDA, the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act. But there is a shortfall that some of these SLPs do have weak implementation and also limited government oversight, leaving gaps for workers' needs and also the company commitments. And essentially, the aim of our study is to evaluate the adequacy and also effectiveness of the company level support provided by the coal mine workers during downscaling. And when we're referring to coal mine workers, we're saying everyone employed, directly employed at the mine, whether it's full-time, fixed term, and also contract basis, but just to clarify that. And our work also looks at identifying some of the gaps and challenges implementing the industry provisions for coal mine workers during downscaling and also closure, and just to also provide some of the recommendations. And overall, our aim is to generate new insights into company and worker perspectives to guide policy planning for a just transition. So our methodology consisted of literature looking at the SLPs, looking at the sustainability and also ESG reports, and also the transition plans and company websites. We also did hold interviews with the company, mining company representatives, the trade unions, and also the just transition practitioners, and then also more interviews with the coal mine workers, the shop stewards as well. So yeah, I don't want to take up much time. We do know what the impact is. So we looked at the financial impacts, the social impact, physical impact, and also the human capital impacts. And followed by that, we also looked at according to age, skills, we also looked at what the labor market position is for them and also assessed what the workers' needs are. So yeah, without taking much time, I'll also just go over an overview of what the social and labor plans entail. So as I said, it is a strong foundation for worker protection and also transitioning planning. And essentially what social and labor plans are, they are a legal instrument defining what the company commitments are for the community and also the employees. And it is a mandatory requirement for mining rights and also should be reviewed and also resubmitted every 5 years. So it entails looking at human resource development, mining community economic development, and also managing downscaling and retrenchment plans, and also the implementation of budget, their financial allocations for the SLP commitments. And then there is a few support regulatory framework guiding these SLPs, looking at Employment Equity Act and also the Labor Relations Act, which is very important for procedural justice and also distributive justice. And then we also have the basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Board-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act, the MPRDA that I mentioned earlier, DMRE, which set out the guidelines for these SLPs, and then the Mining Charter and Mining Charter scorecards, and also the Skills Development Act. Yeah, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague who will go through some of the assessment of the industry provisions just to understand whether these industry provisions meet the workers' needs.
Thank you, colleague Nothembi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simba, and you're working together on this research. Just as a reminder, I think I have heard a lot of people saying we do have existing regulatory frameworks that can be leveraged on to achieve a just transition. I've heard some presenters speaking about SLPs. So the purpose of our research is to examine the effectiveness and the adequacy of existing industry provision in supporting workers during this transition. So without wasting much of our time, I will proceed from where my colleague has left. So when we were doing the assessment of SLPs, just for your info, we used not only SLPs for our research, we also used company websites, we also used sustainability reports as well as ESG reports to actually identify whether the existing industry provisions are able to meet workers' needs during a transition. So when we are assessing the SLPs as a starting point, there are some important elements within the SLPs that needs to be considered for policy design in a transition. As an example, the employment levels. So we did assess the type and nature of employment in each and every coal mine that we were able to assess. So from our assessment, we did find out that employment varies across mines, with the smallest operations employing around 300 people and the largest operations employing around 8,000 workers. And employment in a coal mine typically consists of permanent workers, fixed-term workers, and workers employed by external service providers. I can call them mining contractors. But on average, there is a lot of workers that are employed on a permanent basis. Roughly, there is one outsourced worker per every 3 permanent workers. So that suggests greater employment stability and greater access to full-time benefits. So for me, it's my right-hand side. You'd see the mine coding. So the mines that we have used in our assessment, we have coded them using alphabetical letters for research purposes. These are the mines that we use their SLPs. But when you go through the report, you'd see that we often make reference to actual coal mine names. It doesn't mean that those are coal mines that we used in our SLP assessment. But the information that you see with a coal mine name, it means that that information will obtain the ESG reports and other type of reports that are readily available online, and we have referenced that. Okay, next. All right, so the other important element that we saw in our SLPs that is very important for consideration in policy design for a just transition is labor sending regions. So we did assess labor sending regions to evaluate the extent of labor migration. So, as you know that according to Section 41C of the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Regulations, coal mining companies are supposed to they're supposed to support socioeconomic development through the creation of local employment, which means that when they are employing, they're supposed to prioritize community members. So when we assess the labor sending regions of the workers, majority of the workers, in fact, 84% to be specific, of the workers in coal mines, they come from Mpumalanga province. So remember, the SLPs that we assessed are strictly from Mpumalanga mines. So majority of workers comes from Mpumalanga province. So that means that there may be limited labor mobility from Mpumalanga, suggesting that there is need to develop alternative employment, alternatives employment creation sources, because a lot of people are from Mpumalanga. And then 13% of the workers from SLPs assessed are from other provinces, mainly from Gauteng, Limpopo, KZN, and Eastern Cape. So those workers may need to relocate, suggesting that they may require relocation assistance in this transition. And the 3% from the coal mine assessed are foreign nationals, coming from countries such as Mozambique, Malawi, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe. So when we were doing this assessment of labor sending region section, the challenge that we saw there was the underreporting of outsourced workers, the workers employed by mining contractors. We realized that mining companies, as they report labor sending regions in their SLPs, they're reporting for permanent workers only. That risk overlooking the relocation needs for outsourced workers, complicating the design of a targeted worker policy package for those outsourced workers that might want to relocate back to their home areas. The other section that we assessed was the section on education levels. Education level is very important, as you know that. Education level is mostly used as a proxy for skills, although it is misleading because sometimes higher education does not necessarily translate into having industry-ready skills, especially in the lens of green economy skills. But nevertheless, it remains an important indicator to suggest where reskilling, upskilling, and direct transfer is needed. So we did assess that section. Majority of the workers that we assessed fall within further education training band. That means they have got grade 10 to grade 12. 25% fall within higher education and training. That means they've got at least a diploma, and 11% fall within general education and training. That means they've got up to grade 9. But also our finding is that mining companies are increasingly making grade 12 as a minimum requirement for job, for filling up their job vacancies. So that suggests maybe the reason why those falling within general education and training are low. So moving on to human resource development, my slide might be busy here, but I'll try to simplify it. So we first tried to assess whether mining companies are complying with Skills Development Acts. So as you know, Skills Development Acts requires that mining companies support ongoing training and education for their workers. And our findings are that majority of mining companies does comply with the Skills Development Act in the sense that they've employed a skills development facilitator to oversee the training. They submit workplace skills plans and annual training reports annually. And they're also registered with Mining Qualification Authority, which is the mining SETA. They do contribute to skills development levies, which is 1% of total employee earnings. In fact, some companies goes beyond compliance, like Mine A there. They allocate 5% over and above the 1% towards critical skills development. So we do believe that if we make use of existing legislation and existing company resources, we can foster skills development for a just transition. We also assessed a section on training infrastructure. We really asked what type of infrastructure do mining companies use when they're training their workers. We realized that mining companies make use of in-house resources as well as they make use of external service providers. For example, Mine ABDG, they have training centers that have already been given a training provider status by MQA. Also, mining companies make use of digital platforms, soft infrastructure for training purposes, such as Exaro makes use of My Next e-learning platform for their training purposes. But when we were assessing this area, we realized that majority of training that are offered, especially through digital platforms, are not accredited, requiring us to, that is a policy gap where we need to really recognize priority learning. We also saw that majority of Mining Qualification Authority training providers focus narrowly on core-related skills. And mining companies also reported that if they make use of external service providers, even though they are registered with MQA, majority of them, they are profit-driven, not majority. Some of them, they are profit-driven, asking for many numbers of people, but delivering little impact. We also asked the next question, what type of collaboration do mining companies have when they are training their workers, as this is important for a just transition? We realized that there is some form of collaboration between mining companies, but with selected stakeholders. As an example, some companies collaborate with Colliery Training College in Mpumalanga, but the challenge there is mine-to-mine collaborations remain limited. There was no mine that we saw in their SOP saying that we collaborate with a neighboring mine and pool resources together and train the workers. Again, mine-to-government collaboration remains limited, especially when it comes to green economy skills training. Okay. We then asked the question, what type of human resource development initiatives do mining companies use when they're training their workers? Mining companies make use of adult education training, learnerships, bursaries, and other skills development programs. That is good, but there are also challenges with those initiatives. As an example, for education, adult education training, which is given to those that are considered to be functional illiterate, they are trained to achieve functional literacy and basic numeracy at, I think, grade 9 level. So the challenge is that the mining companies were reporting poor uptake of adult education training. That was linked to information asymmetry and low worker confidence, some workers doubting their abilities. Also, workers, especially those that are near retirement, they are very reluctant in taking adult education training because they require job-ready skills, and sometimes they require stipends to do that type of training. Learnerships, many mining companies offer learnership. They are mostly correlated skills, and they are given to permanent workers, excluding outsourced workers. So that leaves outsourced workers at risk. Some companies say outsourced workers are supposed to apply for learnership as community members. And we know that doesn't happen, because if they apply as community members, they are faced with a trade-off between choosing a learnership or choosing to carry on with their employment. Bursaries. Majority of mining companies offer bursaries or some form of in-house study assistance to their workers. In fact, some extend the offer to workers' dependents. The challenge with bursaries that is offered is also it is limited in reach, because it targets permanent employees only. It also targets those workers that meet certain academic requirements, leaving out workers that have got low qualification level, and that is a gap. Bursaries also, in some companies, they require repayment if the worker does not manage to complete the program, and that limits participation in terms of bursaries. And other skills training programs that we saw in their SOPs, they include everyone, include outsourced workers, but they are mostly compliance-based, and they do not offer green skills. On the other side, other type of training is bursaries. Other type of training is leadership and business skills. That is for management staff, leaving out anyone that is not in management. All right. Okay, cool. So I think let me jump over to two last slides. But essentially the slides that I'm skipping, we looked at measures that mining companies are committing to provide in the event that mine closure is unavoidable, and what are the measures that mining companies are willing to provide in the event that job losses can be saved. So those are the slides that we looked at and the challenges. So let me speak about the challenges in overall. The last two slides. So despite the ambitious intention of SLPs, we found out that they are prevented from making a full impact because of the many challenges that confront them. The challenges that we saw, we classified them in three phases. That is the design phase, the implementation phase, and enforcement phase. In the design phase, there is lack of meaningful worker consultation. There is also institutional disconnect and exclusion of municipalities. There is also lack of uniformity in SOP provisions. We do saw that DMRE provides submission guidelines for SOPs, but it looks like some mining companies follow that word to word without detailing implementation plan and practicality. In the implementation phase, there are a lot of governance gap, weak coordination, misalignment of stakeholders. On the worker side, there is poor uptake, there is dropout due to information asymmetry and other factors. The other challenge was late activation of SLP support. It's only activated at mine closure or at retrenchment, of which many people would not care about training after that time. There's also uncertainty and disruption of SLPs during mine ownership changes. But in the enforcement phase, the biggest challenge was non-delivery of SLP commitments. What mine companies report is different from what has been reported. Also, the other challenge was access to SLPs remained limited, especially the new current SLPs. So you can't hold mining companies accountable of what you don't know. I won't go through all the recommendations, but just the one recommendation from that we provided for trade unions is that the trade unions should continue negotiating some of the just transition measures and form part of collective bargaining agreements to hold mining companies accountable. They also need to secure enhanced severance pay with minimum threshold that change yearly as living cost changes. This is because the severance package of 1 week was considered grossly inadequate for the workers given the rise in living cost as well as for the low paid workers. So we have a lot of recommendations that we have given per each stakeholder. We will share the report at the end. Thank you.
Amandla. Injury to one. Ala babereki, ala. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chere. As you can see, I'm a he. One day I was nearly lucky, but I was already taken. I got put into a room with a female attending a conference. Unfortunately, I was taken at that time, so there was no benefits to it. So my presentation is the workers' perception of climate change and the just transition in South Africa. It's a literature review from the Just Transition Labour Center. It was one of the initial exercises we undertook as we were starting into our new roles. It feeds into what are we going to do as the Just Transition Labour Center. So I thought before we start embarking on different researches, let's check what is still missing and lacking out there. That is why I chose to do this particular literature review. So the study was intentionally designed to look, so it was just a search of the lay of the land to say what research is being done on what workers say about climate change and the just transition. And I intentionally left out the coal sector because the coal sector is one of the sectors that is well covered because of the impact of climate of fossil fuel industry and its direct implications on South Africa, given that we rely on coal for our electricity, and that affects beyond Eskom, it affects all other industries based on the fact that they still need energy. So that's why I excluded that sector. And so this is the structure of my report where I'm looking at national surveys and key trends. And then I look at the TIPS National Employment and Vulnerability Assessment. This is the one from 2019 because the 2025 hasn't been published yet. Agriculture workers, informal workers, transport workers, tourism workers, and then identify the research gaps. So like I said, I've already introduced that this is intentionally focused on other sectors beyond coal. And one of the important surveys was done by the Human Science Research Council and the PCC, which looks at climate change awareness between 2007 and 2023, which found that 83% of South Africans have an awareness of what is of climate change, and 72% of respondents agreed with the need to transition to alternative energy sources. A similar international study by the UNDP, which People's Climate Survey for 2024, which found that in South Africa, 90% of South Africans had thought about climate change in the recent years. However, only 9% of South Africans knew what the term just transition meant. So we can extrapolate that to the worker population that will probably have a similar finding. And in line with the purpose of my study, I noticed that these both surveys, even though they provide important data on the awareness of climate change or just transition, they were not disaggregated based on employment status, which means they did not look at workers or whether somebody was unemployed or not. And going further, they did not break down different sectors and different workers. And when we look at the National Vulnerability Survey, which was commissioned, which was done in 2019 based off the requirements of the Climate Change Response White Paper of 2011, which is analysis of potential climate change related impacts of vulnerable groups, workers and communities. So they looked at 5 value chains: coal, metals, petroleum-based transport and agriculture. But even though it provides a lot of useful and important data, as it will also be represented later, it does not report directly on the voice of workers and what they say, the workers in these sectors. This is the design and purpose of the study, but it still offers an important entry point, for example, for us to go on as the JTLC to go interview workers in these sectors. And using the NEVA study on looking at agricultural workers, which identifies that agriculture is vulnerable because of it relies on nature. It's impacted by rain, it's impacted by droughts, it can even be impacted by heavy winds. And workers in this sector are directly vulnerable to what happens with the weather and with climate. But even there, even though the study does differentiate how workers in the formal value chains of agro processing are better off than workers in informal farming or who are self farmers, or in smaller provinces where they do subsistence farming and do some selling on the sides of the roads. It still does not capture what they say, what their concerns are. And then I also looked at informal workers, which is a sector that is overlooked. Like right now, we have an issue with the Joburg municipality finally trying to implement bylaws and removing informal workers. But they also get impacted negatively when we have extreme weather like rain, and they have to deal with the difficulty of trying to protect their produce, especially those who sell fresh veggies under extreme heat. And then they are generally exposed to extreme weather events because they work outside and not in your offices or secured factories. So here I just focus on waste pickers and street vendors. Just looking at waste pickers, I found that there's organizations like the South African Cities Network and the South African Waste Pickers Associations. So the South African Cities Network was mentioned earlier as having published a report, which I'm going to go look at, about how the municipalities can implement just transition policies. But it does pay attention to the role and issues of waste pickers. While the South African Waste Pickers Association is an organization that works with waste pickers. There are 90,000 waste pickers in South Africa, and between 4,000 and 6,000 from all 9 provinces are registered. And then on the academic side, you have research being done by the Geography, Archaeology, and Environment Studies at various universities, further giving waste pickers a voice. And they also work with groundwork, which supports their campaigns and reports on the different campaigns of waste pickers. So the point I'm making here is that waste pickers have a voice, they have platforms that are there for them. And also, even though initially waste pickers were not recognized, recently in 2020, with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, in collaboration with the Department of Science and Technology, published a report looking at waste pickers integration guidelines, building recycling economy and improving livelihoods through integration of the informal sector. So the point I'm making here is that there is a platform, there is a voice for informal waste pickers. So if we as JTLC need to do research, we don't have to go far. We don't even have to do our own new research. We can rely on these resources. And when we look at street vendors, similarly, because street vendors are a global phenomenon, the ILO does provide a lot of research looking, for example, in 2023, they published a study, Women and Men in the Informal Economy, and a statistical update. And then in South Africa, we have the Women in Informal Employment, WIGO, Globalizing and Organizing, which helps particularly women in the informal sector. They also similarly publish research, such as the informal economy and COVID-19, differentiate impact and uneven recovery, the informal sector's role in food security or informal economy revisited. So with both, even though these we're talking about waste pickers and informal traders, I argue that I can find information and sources that I can go to find out what are they saying, what are the concerns of waste pickers. I even found an academic study. Okay, thank you. And then there's transport workers. One of the most significant documents I found was the Department of Transport and Trades report looking at, strategy, the green transport strategy for South Africa. It aims to reduce carbon emissions by 5% by 2050. And its objectives are to enable the transport sector to contribute its fair share to a national effort to combat climate change and facilitate the sector's role in just transition. But however, even though with all these objectives, it still doesn't mention workers specifically or address the role of trade unions in transport and the shift to a green transport. Besides, I didn't find any other study that was significant that talked about the role of workers. I only found one study by a student that was released in 2012, which looks at the labor movement response to climate change, which was a case study of Satau. Even in this study, the researcher spoke to shop stewards and other Satau officials. They didn't speak directly to workers because, sometimes workers and officials can have a different perspective and experiences. And it didn't have a section dedicated to surveys or literature that highlights the plight of bus drivers, taxi drivers, rail workers, or port workers and how they are impacted by climate change. The NIVA also looks at tourism workers, which can also be affected by climate because South Africa is one of the countries with the best climate, and people come here to enjoy the beautiful weather, the beaches and things, and it can affect climate, bad weather and floods and things like that can affect your ability to host tourists. So despite the recognition of the impact of climate on the tourism sector, there's no published research on the impact on tourism workers, what is happening in terms of when there's floods and things like that, and if there are plans for just transition. So in conclusion, what I found is that there are significant gaps in terms of research regarding the impact and workers' responses outside of the coal sector. And high-level studies like the 2015 HSRC study provide valuable information, but it does not tell us what workers directly say. There's generally limited exploration of how workers develop their existing views on climate change and just transition. So there's lack of granular knowledge of what workers in diverse sectors believe, need, or propose in terms of just transition and climate change. So in line with it, like I said in the beginning, the purpose of this exercise is to argue that there's need for further research focusing on workers in other climate affected sectors in South Africa. Current literature is not yet sufficient, and particularly from a trade union perspective, how do you get the tourism sector or the coal sector to further develop their advocacy and bargaining strategies? So we need to conduct that research, talk to workers. And we can even with the PCC studies, we can complement such studies with dedicated surveys that are qualitative and go and talk to workers, even with the studies that my colleagues are doing at TIPS. We can go join them in those research or even use that research that they've conducted to be the starting point for us to go talk to workers instead of repeating what has already been said. Okay, thank you.
Afternoon, everyone. So my name is Seutame Maimele. I'm going to be presenting on water carbon adjustments and just to show some appreciation. I think it's good to also engage with labor on some of these issues. So I'm happy that I'm busy presenting to different labor unions. So as much as there've been a lot of engagements in the space with a few, I think the unions will broadly benefit from the research. So just a bit of background. So the research was done for the Presidential Climate Commission to just try to highlight what is actually coming from water carbon adjustments and how South Africa should be thinking on how to respond or position itself with regards to the introduction of some of these mechanisms. Okay, so just the content of my presentation is just is based on the the paper that we've done for the PCC. So hopefully in the next few weeks or months, it's going to be loaded on the PCC website. So I know that some stakeholders are present here. They've seen the earlier versions of that paper. So just to as a start, just to give you context and situation analysis of what's happening in the border carbon adjustment space, then highlight some of the other issues that we've identified when we're doing the research, then highlight the strategic pathways to mitigate some of those issues. So what we've seen, I think, even from the previous presentation, is that there's a global transition that is accelerating, and border carbon adjustment is one mechanism that is being used, and we start seeing a lot of jurisdictions. So seeing in the EU, for example, and also in the UK, where they are also thinking of introducing this border carbon adjustment. So the EU one is coming online next year. So of course, there have been a transition period between 2023 and now, which is coming to an end in December. Then from next year, Jan, then we'll start seeing a lot of financial implications of the mechanism. Of course, there's a proposal to delay the financial implications of the mechanism. But what we're seeing is that these mechanisms are disrupting value chains. So how, for example, we produce some of the goods that, for example, in the iron and steel, aluminum, chemicals, and a few other value chains that are impacted. And by that, we also see that it's going to have a direct impact on jobs if we don't act on some of these introduction of border carbon adjustments. So this is just a picture of how, for example, the South African economy is vulnerable from the two mechanisms that are coming online. So the EU one is coming 2026, and the UK one possibly 2027. Then from what you see here is that iron and steel, aluminium, and chemicals, specifically looking at fertilizers, are highly impacted. Of course, we've been doing a lot of engagement in the space with industries as well as with the government and also labor to try to create a more common position on how, for example, South Africa should be responding to some of these vulnerabilities. Then just going to skip this slide. So then some of the other issues that we've highlighted of come across from the research is that as much as there's a lot of awareness now, so since we've been engaging in the space, and I think even now, awareness still, are lacks amongst a lot of, different stakeholders. So of course, there's been a lot of mechanisms in the space where we're seeing, for example, governments, for example, I think we've seen the Western Cape government, I think earlier this year, doing a lot of awareness for some of the impacted firms in the Western Cape. And, but generally what we see is that, there's a lack of awareness, especially, amongst different stakeholders that are impacted. Then the other issue is related to the institutional mechanism. So what we know is that everyone is working, in isolation. So labor, industry, as well as government, they're all working in silos. So there's no a common, I think you might see it in the later part of the presentation. So there's no a common place where, for example, labor, business can go and say, these, are some of the issues in relation to border carbon adjustments. Then the other one is related to technology. So what we know is that a lot of firms, especially globally, they are required to report GHG emissions at a product level. And at the moment, we, of course, there's been progress in the space as well, because a lot of firms have been forced to, start reporting GHG emissions, the product level between 2023 and now. So there've been, progress in that space, but generally, what we see is that this the technology is not available. If where it is available is expensive, which might also have implications for how firms are operating. Then the other one, these are just other factors that are also contributing, just to touch on them, because they also affect the export basket that we set into some of these jurisdictions. So what we see is that as we know that the South African electricity is coal intensive, And by that, we, translate to higher GHG emission intensity for some of the products that we produce, which has, is becoming an issue. Then there are other issues. For example, we see in terms of the carbon, carbon tax locally that is available, so is low by, by international standard, comparing it with these mechanisms that are introducing this, border carbon adjustment. So, as much as we have that mechanism in place, I know that is a controversial, conversation or topic to touch on. But, looking at most of the goods that we produce goes into some of those markets. So, there's an opportunity there which I will highlight later on. The other issues, of course, electricity, and also the logistic issues. We've seen that there's been some issues in that space, so I'm not gonna go in detail there, but I'm sure everyone is aware of that. Then from a high level, so this is just strategic pathways that we're thinking around. So there's as you will see later on in the detailed report, so we've done an analysis of some of these options, and the ones that you see here are the ones that we think they are viable in the immediate, medium, and also longer term. So this is just a high level picture, but I'll go in detail in the next few slides. So in the immediate, what needs to happen is that, again, as I've highlighted, that there's no a single point of authority, so there should be a need to establish that around climate and trade. So, for example, I'm just touching on border carbon adjustment, but because if you look at climate and trade issues broadly, so there's a lot of other issues. For example, in terms of due diligence, especially that comes with the EU, the European Union deforestation regulations. But in this case here, we're thinking that the DTIC and the DFFE can be leaders of that. So once you face issues as a firm or a certain stakeholder, then you can engage with that single point of authority. And again, launch of a targeted awareness campaign. So as we've seen that there's still more information that still needs to be shared amongst different stakeholders. So we're thinking that there should be a more targeted approach, for example, approaching labor, firms that might, because at the moment we're engaging with the firms that are impacted. So there might be a need for other firms that are thinking of, exporting to some of those jurisdictions to also make them aware of some of these issues. And the other one on the MRVs technologies. So here, so there's the solution that the CSIR is busy developing now. So I'm not going to go much in detail because I don't have much time, but I'll be happy to answer some of these questions during the question and answer session. But in this case here, there's a need to start upscaling that. Then the other one is on the carbon tax again. On the carbon tax story, so every time I raise it, it raises a lot of concerns. But in this case here, if I have enough time, I might engage with everyone on how, for example, we should be thinking about reforming the domestic carbon tax to retain some of these opportunities that comes with the introduction of this border carbon adjustment. And of course, the other one is to continually engage with the EU on some of these issues. So, for example, if labor, firms and every stakeholder that is impacted, they should be able to raise some of those concerns. And, later on, the delegation that goes into, engagement with the EU, then they should be raising some of these issues. Then in the medium term, so in this case here, the pathways that we've highlighted or entry points or interventions is that there should be a need to support energy decarbonization. So as we've highlighted earlier on, that the problem for South African exports or South African products is the emission intensity that goes into the production of some of those goods. So there should be acceleration in terms of energy decarbonization. So there's good news in that space that, for example, the accounting of scope 2 emissions from the EU has been postponed for I think in 2 years' time. So there should be some relief that comes with that there. So the other issue again, just want to touch one last point here because I think I'm out of time. So the key one that I want to raise is on, for example, green industrial policy. So in this case here, we've seen that there's a increased demand of these green products. Of course, as much as there's demand, sometimes people are privy to pay for some of those products, but there should be a need for South Africa to start thinking about that market. So the border carbon adjustments, they present the opportunity for us to start thinking about or innovating our production processes so that we can later on utilize some of these opportunities that comes with the introduction of border carbon adjustment. So yeah, I'm just going to cut it there because I can see that the chair has already given me an indication. Thanks.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Lisa Ali. I am at the Just Transition Labour Centre. And this study essentially falls under our internal research agenda. And it is quite an important topic considering what an important year it is for climate policy. Essentially, we have the G20, we have COP30. And so I'll just move on, go right into the presentation. There we go. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the contents into too much detail since I'm quite time-strapped. But just to give a background, I conducted a study just purely based on secondary data. Firstly, a literature review, a policy review, and then a content analysis on grey literature, which is institutional reports, government documents, working papers, policy briefs, and so no primary data was conducted. I think that I will, okay, let me go into background. So essentially, I'm gonna skip over a few things just in the interest of time. But I think it is important to note that South Africa is quite uniquely challenged. We are dealing with a multi-pronged dilemma. We are trying to decarbonize. We are the highest emitter in the region of emissions. And so we are trying to meet our emissions targets in terms of our national policy, but then also our international agreements that we party to. We have an energy security crisis, just due to aging infrastructure. What else? Issues such as load shedding and Eskom not being able to meet our national peak baseload demand. But then also we have the just transition imperative, right? To ensure that any kind of transition and energy transition needs to ensure that workers are at the forefront, workers are part of planning, workers are centered. It's a labor-centered transition. Okay. So I'll just skip over the NDCs, but essentially it was at COP26 where South Africa essentially ensured that a just transition was centered, it was principle in the document. And obviously we know the main purpose of a transition needs to be empowering marginalized communities, empowering workers, empowering vulnerable communities and small businesses as they need to benefit from a move to a green economy. And then I'll move to the challenges surrounding a green economy. Those include low growth, skills gaps, limited technology, aging infrastructure, political constraints, and fragile institutions. Okay, I'm gonna just essentially just tie this up. So in terms of the last point, it is quite an important one because it essentially influences all the rest of the slide, our issue of moving from policy planning to implementation. And the fact that the high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment essentially shape and color the policy space, the energy space, and what makes it that much more difficult and unique as South Africa to move to climate policies that are concrete and tangible. But it is difficult when we are dealing with socioeconomic impacts and factors that do need to be, where our policies do need to be informed by them, but it makes it that much more difficult and challenging to achieve. Okay, so there are a lot of climate policies in the country, but I essentially settled on 2 adaptation policies, 2 mitigation policies, and then 3 means of implementation policies. As you can see, these are the policies that I've included. It's the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, the Climate Change Bill, the IRP, the carbon tax, the Just Transition Framework, the Green Fund, and the Jtlc. It's important to have these different types of policies, to deal with climate change adequately. We need mitigation to cut emissions. We need adaptation to protect people and nature from, climate change effects. But then we also need means of implementation to ensure that those adaptation and mitigation policies are tied together with finance, technology, skills, for these adaptation and mitigation pathways. Okay, and so I conducted a policy review, utilizing or adapting rather a framework by Zwane and Monaisa and Chere, alongside a Marxist critique of the previous policies that were just mentioned. And so I analyzed these policies according to certain measures, so institutional measures, financial measures, socioeconomic measures, technological and market-based measures. And then from those measures, I then extrapolated or pulled out barriers to those measures. So corresponding barriers to these institutional, financial, socioeconomic, etc. measures. And so, sure, okay. So I'm not going to go into the detail, interest of time. So these are the institutional barriers, the financial barriers. I have the socioeconomic, technological, and market-based barriers here. Obviously, you'll get the presentation. So sorry for the rush. And then, okay, I'll skip this slide. And then, okay, these are good. So with the content analysis, which was the analysis of the secondary data, the institutional reports, the government documents, the policy reports, the policy briefs, working papers, these are the themes and then the sub-themes that came out of that study. These are South African themes: the energy sector, the local government, finance, legislation, and nature-based policies. And then I subsequently then conducted an analysis regarding the global themes corresponding to the South African themes. And these include adaptation versus mitigation, the just transition, climate finance, and then next page, it's government's technological aspects and market-based instruments. And then I ended with policy recommendations. I think it's important to note that many of these recommendations have been said in many forums. I'm sure you've seen half of them. Some of my colleagues here, previous panel, have included some of these recommendations. There may be some new ones you see, but what I think is important to note is that, yes, these have been highlighted. They do need stronger governance, finance, technological support, social protection, and they are, well documented. And they just show that the main challenge is arguably not identifying solutions, but moving them into practice and, something concrete. And they do highlight, the ongoing gaps between policy dialogue and design and implementation. And in order for us to get to a point of meaningful progress, we need to move beyond the critique and get to the point of these concrete, tangible solutions in order to get to context-specific pathways. And so addressing these challenges is essential in order for us to get to a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for all of that. We started off by talking about the effectiveness of the implementation of particular support mechanisms for workers, right? SLPs, where we learned that there are challenges with regards to design, implementation, and enforcement mechanisms that render these ineffective in what they should actually be doing. And then we also learned about worker perceptions of climate change. And I think a key issue that was raised by that discussion is that when we think about the just transition, we understand it to be a structural transformation that should happen across various sectors. But what we understand about the nature of the research is very much targeted on the energy sector, basically neglecting other types of other sectors that are impacted by climate change. And so workers then are not effectively organized in that sector. And then we spoke about carbon border adjustments, where we are seeing how these can impinge upon our ability to trade and therefore the impacts on workers and the various pathways in trying to resolve that. And then we also heard from Ali as well with regards to the various other recommendations that are key that were put on the table. That's a very rough summary, but let me take it to the floor and ask if there are any questions that anyone has at the minute. Okay, I'll take you. One. Okay, I'll have you, and then maybe there's someone online as well who'd like to speak. Go ahead, comrade.
Thank you, Dr. Basani. Good day, everyone. My name is Maimele from Seutame. I'm also part of the COSATU Climate Change Committee. Thanks to your panelists for their presentations. One of the key issues that we normally talk about in our discussions is the issue of the upskilling and reskilling as a demand that we would like to put forward. In fact, we always stresses that because it will assist us in aligning and making sure that no worker is left behind. And I'm glad that I see that being presented there to say there is also the issue of the gap and all that. But my question says, because what we normally say would say, we want workers to be upskilled and reskilled. We don't want anyone to be left out, but we do not have the direct skills that we put forward, whether for the workers that are in the mining sector, in the coal sector, and all that. So now, in a way that we can be able to put our demands forward as trade unions, sector, what is it that would then need to put forward to say this is our demand? Sitting with right now is we are waiting for government to tell us how they want this thing to be done, how they want a certain sector to be dealt with and all that. So if we need to own it up, we have to have certain skills that we are putting forward, not only looking in the technical side of things. We want to cover all the workers and make sure that no one is left out. So what will be the skills that we need to be noting down to say this is our demands and all that? The other part is the issue of the green industrialization part across the transport sector as well. There we are still very, very much quiet about it. On our side, there's unions. The union, we are busy talking, matter. There isn't much that you are putting to say this is how we want our green transport to look like. We are not there yet. And my concern is that while we are still busy talking about it, our government is like driving a train that is running 280 speed. Now we are still driving on 40 kilometers per hour. That is the problem that we are sitting with. So maybe we can then say, for different sectors, these are the skills that we need to put. And I'm glad that Comrade Hamida raised it earlier to say we should not only focus on energy, because while we are dealing with energy, there's the issue of food security here in the agriculture. There's the issue, like right now you see outside, Hori, how is it the weather? Maybe now when we are driving, I'm using a train, I'm using a taxi, I'm using a car and all that, you find that the bridge has been washed away. How are we going to get home? So these are the things that we then need to be talking about to say, how do we prepare ourselves as labor? What is it that our policy look like so that we can put it forward as a demand, not just being told how the transition has to look like. Thank you.
Take you, comrade, and then I'll.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. One question on Seutame. So the issue that I want to raise is that the shift towards a green transition, to green sectors, by its very nature is very expensive. And of the recommendations that emerge from the research from TIPS, I don't see that quite articulated concretely. And I'm raising this because if you look at most of the South African sectors that are affected with high carbon emitting emissions, the shift for it to take place, there will be a need for the state to actually invest a lot of resources to pay for that shift. And I don't see it happening. I look at the allocations that whether is from the budget, I don't see that indication coming up. Whether I look at the development finance institutions, what is allocated to them for this is very low. So I think that there's a study that IEJ and did with COSATU. I think it raises a lot of issues around how to finance the green transition. And I think that it will be good to interface with that study and start to a process around how we could do a domestic mobilization. So there are quite interesting proposals around domestic mobilization that are there, so I think it would be good to look into that and link that with what could be the way forward around the response to Seutame. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to first take Ashley Benjamin and then Comrade Ruth. I'll close the session for responses and then I'll come back to you guys. Okay. Oh, and then, sorry, there's also Comrade Bongani. So Ashley Benjamin, Comrade Ruth, and then Bongani. I believe, okay, sorry, the question is right in front of me. Are there any conditionalities with grants for the just transition? What would future green jobs look like? Okay, that's a question from her. And then Comrade Ruth, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Ruth Ndlokotsi from SAFTU. My question is in relation to the SLP. I think the first presentation that was made, that there is an acknowledgement, the provisions that we have, they are not implemented effectively. And over and above that, there are proposals that we need to utilize the engagement at the plant level to have agreements with our employers so that some of the initiatives can be implemented at that level. The question that I'm asking in relation to the research is, we are mindful of the fact of how collective bargaining are being undermined and the strength that workers are having at the shop floor about the effectiveness of the proposals that you are putting on the table. To how far has your research gone into that level, digging deeper about the agency that workers can have besides what you are actually proposing? Because of these common cause that issues of centralized bargaining, you can have an agreement and later that agreement, it will be undermined. And what else what is the agency that workers are having in ensuring that whatever that is being agreed upon can be implemented? Thanks so much.
Very clear. Thank you. Comrade Bongani? Online?
Hi, comrade. Good day. Thank you. I would like to start with the latter speaker who gave us a presentation on chips. On green economy and tangible tangible jobs creation. South African green economy is expanding through renewable energy, waste management, and sustainable infrastructure. Now, what mechanisms are in place to ensure green job creation reaches vulnerable places like townships, according to the study that they did? And how are green jobs being tracked? That's another thing. We keep on hearing about green jobs, but then now there's no tracking and evaluated for quality and not quantity. And on climate vulnerable communities and low carbon transition, South Africa climate vulnerability is acute to and prone to floods, heat waves, and infrastructure collapse. Thus affect poor communities, the vulnerable communities. How are vulnerable communities being engaged in the design of climate adaptation projects according to the study, the research study that has been done? Are models for community-owned renewable energy and nature, are there models for renewable-owned energy and energy-based solutions? And Chair, I was just jotting down everything as they were talking. The first presenter, thank you for your comprehensive presentation on just transition on South African coal workers. I appreciate the depth of your research and the reflection in your study, particularly the focus on social and labor plans, the impact assessment covering financial, physical, and social dimensions. I would like to raise a few concerns with your study. Your data clearly shows the extreme fragmentation in the coal mining workforce. The employment statistics reveal that mines have vastly different worker compositions. Given this extreme fragmentation across employment types and mine types and sizes, the educational levels and the regional context, do you genuinely believe your study can translate into actionable supported mechanisms that address these realities you've identified in your study? The second speaker on informal sector, who gave us I think the second presentation on informal sector. Given the document vulnerabilities of informal sector, given the vulnerabilities of your document, the documentations, your document lists the vulnerabilities of informal sector, particularly strip vendors, waste pickers, to climate change impacts such as economic losses, health risk. How can your study, particularly the study that you've done and your organization, like improve those vulnerabilities? How does your study say we can improve those vulnerabilities? Or I'm just finishing now, Chair.
I'm going to have to cut. I'm very sorry.
I'm left with only one.
I understand. No, sorry, comrade. Otherwise, I'd be out of order. right? They are actually, I'm being told that the other session that the other round that I wanted to have I can't have it. So I'm really sorry. We're going to take questions now. Thank you very much for your inputs. I mean, not questions, but answers. Yes, in the order that I think people presented would help.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. So I think there are a lot of questions for our section, and I'll try to answer them as best as possible. Sorry if I don't reach to your question. I think the first question, it was based on what type of skills should we advocate for? I really don't have an answer for that one, but I mean, as we know, we need demand-led skills. So due to time, I didn't manage to cover that section, but one of the challenges that we saw when it comes to mine company trainings that they are offering, they call them portable skills training for the workers to be able to use them in other sectors. We realized also that in terms of determination of type of skills, it was based on, in some cases, workers' preference. And in that case, workers' preference are not linked to labor demand. So as a result, there is a mismatch between labor skills, labor supply, and labor demand. So what we really need to look at here is what are the realistic economic diversification strategies, economic diversification opportunities for Mpumalanga. I appreciate that there's a lot of research that is underway that is being done. Even at TIPS, we are doing that research to identify the real economic diversification opportunities. And having identified those opportunities, it is what we need then to say, what are the people's, we need to give workers a menu of options that are available. And then they have to select based on their preference, what skills do they want? And that way, I think it will work. Moving on to the next question. About what?
Collective bargaining.
About collective bargaining, thank you for that question. You said, I think we have seen that a lot of issues that we include in collective bargaining are not being followed. So I think the starting point here is for a just transition, we need to include some of the just transition instruments in the current legislation. Such as the MPRDA, you'd see that when it was developed, I think that was 2002, it was not considering the impact of climate change. It was not considering the just transition principles. So given that companies might not seem to follow what collective bargaining agreements say, I think the starting point is perhaps one of the recommendations which we gave was to relook at maybe revising the legislation to actually incorporate just transition instruments into it. The other one was on
the fragmentation.
Fragmentation. So ideally what we were doing here is our argument, as we said, was to say government cannot do this just transition on its own. Same as companies. Companies cannot, government cannot only rely on the legislation that is already there for companies to achieve a just transition. So what we were doing here is we're trying to look at existing industry provision and look at the challenges that prevent them from making a full impact. But we have seen that an SLP can be used as a starting point to support a just transition, but only if the challenges that we have identified through this research are mitigated. We also further advised, I think, provided recommendation in the sense that a lot of commitments, whether they are followed or not followed, but when we looked at SLPs, the lot of commitments that we saw in SLPs are active labor market strategies that have been recommended in the Just Transition Framework. But what was missing there was, I think, social protection and passive labor market policies. What we recommend government needs to intervene and complement that support to ensure a just transition is achieved. And in terms of how jobs will look like in a green economy, I have no answer for that. But what research has been saying is there is a positive correlation between green economy and employment. Yeah.
Yep. Take it.
There you go.
I think just to add on the question of what skills and what green jobs, I think sometimes you mustn't get hung up on skills because some of the mitigation measures and adaptation measures for climate change don't require a lot of skills. Like, for example, waste pickers, they don't need skills. They just commit themselves to picking waste because they've got a motivation to it. They don't need skills. And even if we were to adopt it at municipal level, mitigation of climate change in a city like Johannesburg would be to make sure that our drainage systems are clean. You just need people to go in and clean them so that the water flows, it doesn't flood the roads, it flows where it's supposed to go. And on the question from Comrade Mabu, and what do we need to do? We that's what JTLC is here for. We need to get directives from you guys. If you already know that you can see that it's quiet, but government is moving. It's up to you to direct us to say, go do this research. And once we come up with that research, you must then use it and let us know what kind of training you need from us to help you and make it a part of collective bargaining. And it's something that over the long term or even in the short term, that trade unions need to start doing and saying, we're going to start developing policies for bargaining at the workplace and also influencing government policies to pursue NETLEC or the PCC. And also, even though it wasn't directed at me, the question from Comrade Ruth and it's the same that we know that collective bargaining is being eroded. The coal sector has moved away from the bargaining council, the Central Mining Bargaining Council. So then, because climate change affects, I mean, the closure of coal mines, whether it's climate change related or specific to the company, affects communities. So now we have to reconnect with communities, go back to social movement, unionism, where we're tying workplace issues to community issues because that is what it is. And also, I think it's Comrade Bongani on the informal sector. It's about then influencing government municipal policies in terms of how are they providing spaces for informal traders, and it may need partnerships and collaboration with municipal unions. So it's really about organizing and collaborating.
Thank you.
So I think the question on finance not coming out, that was asked by Ndade Tengo. So there's I mean, the finance issue is a different conversation, right? But from the paper that we've done, there's as maybe next time you have time, you might have to just look into it. So there's components of, financing for example, the border carbon adjustment, interventions that we've highlighted there. So what we've realized is that, there's no fiscal space, the balance sheets of some of the impacted sectors is not, working out. So we've seen, for example, in the Sasol case, they've presented the case. We know the case at AMSA. And I think yesterday I was also part of a panel where Hulamin did highlight that if there is no, or if they include indirect emissions, they will just have to close shop. But, and I think the question that you're asking highlight the question that I didn't want to expand on, because I was having some time issues there. So, but the issues about reforming the carbon tax with recycling mechanism. So there's an initiative that we are thinking of, even from engagement with industries that they don't get a lot of decarbonization funding. So there's no support that is coming from whether the JET IP or even from DFIs that goes to support some of the impacted sectors by CBAM. So there's a need to establish a decarbonization fund, right, to support the impacted sectors. Then the other one, of course, as I think you might have seen it in the presentation, that there should be an expansion of Section 12I, especially with energy efficiency technologies. Of course, we've seen the DTIC has been active in that space, but there should be a need to have an engagement there. Then from the private sector, so we see that the private sector has been, investing in that space. For example, Hulamin, even AMSA and a few others have been investing in MRV infrastructure, but there should be a lot more engagement around financing some of those interventions you've highlighted. And of course, we know the work is going to be continuing at NetLAC, so I think is a important question to raise first.
Thank you. Comrade, sorry, comrade. Ali.
Okay. So how can vulnerable communities be engaged? I think it's important to note, local governments' challenges with regards to capacity constraints, their funding, the coordination, their planning, and how climate change, how the crisis impacts these communities, and then how these policies impact communities. I think we forget that these informal communities are that much more susceptible to these climate change impacts because they are historically in areas that just based on, the apartheid structures, colonialism and where they're situated, and then how we then need to actually look at the kind of underdeveloped sectors in terms of research, like water, waste, land, and how those then feed into the crisis, how that then feeds into them being that much more susceptible. And so, sure, we want to get, communities in rooms, in engagement, there at the helm of policy planning, right through to implementation, but to understand what is happening on the ground, how they're that much more disenfranchised, how we then need to empower them in a more nuanced, more colored way, that is not just based on institutional factors, financial factors, but actually understanding what their realities are on the ground. And that needs to be understood first before we actually move to high-level policy spaces.
Thank you very much. Comrades, unfortunately, I can't take more questions, but there is the opportunity of lunch to engage the speakers even further. And I just want to thank the speakers for their very insightful presentations, and also want to thank you for your engagement, both here and online. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Just a few housekeeping announcements as well. There are a number of things we can't get to with questions. We apologize. Time is running. You can engage with us as we go with the center and through lunch now and the rest of today. So please remember to do that. But also after the conference, there'll be a chance to engage with us as well. This is not the only opportunity for this research. We will be circulating it post-conference. And then lastly, we're going to break for lunch now. 2:10, we'll reconvene. Thank you, everyone.